Quick recap. The engine was overheating. I've pulled the cylinder head off because the head gasket blew and flattened it. I've done a little bit more work on it since you last saw it, and it's now flat to within 25 microns. I've cleaned and checked the top of the block to make sure that it's flat. But before I put the new gasket and cylinder head on, I need to clear the holes for the head bolts to make sure there's no fluids got down inside them. Not doing this could result in one of the head bolts getting hydrolocked. Now, the best case scenario here is that the head doesn't get fully torqued down and the head gasket goes again. The worst case scenario is it could actually crack the block. There are two dowels that go into the top of the cylinder block. These act as locators for the cylinder head gasket and the cylinder head. This is the new head gasket. It's a multi-layer steel gasket, which is a lot less compressible than more traditional gaskets. This means it can handle higher in-cylinder pressures. Where the timing chain comes up into the cylinder head just requires a light application of liquid gasket. And here it goes. Nice and carefully, I want to make sure that I get the cylinder head lined up with those dowels and don't scratch the surface as I'm putting it down. There we go. A little push, and that's it located. I put a little bit of oil on the threads of the head bolts and the tops of the washers. This is to ensure that there isn't too much friction when tightening the bolts and I achieve the correct torque setting. On the subject of torquing head bolts, it's critically important that the bolts are done up to the correct torque and also done up in the correct order. This information's always available in the workshop manual for the particular engine. The basic principle for doing up cylinder head bolts is that you start in the middle and work your way towards either end. This ensures that you end up with an even clamping pressure on the cylinder head gasket. If you remember back to the previous video, you might recall that when we were removing the cylinder head, we worked from the outside towards the centre, so this is the exact opposite. This particular cylinder head requires each bolt to then be turned 180 degrees after torquing, but that's done in 2 steps of 90 degrees, so you actually have to tighten the bolts 3 times. There are a couple of little cap head screws just at the front of the timing case that need nipping down as well. It's that magnet on a stick again. Getting the cam chain gear in is a bit of a faff. There's a little washer on the front of the assembly that I really don't want to drop down the front of the timing case. By putting a screwdriver through the bolt hole, it allows the gear to sit a little bit lower, which makes getting the timing chain on a little bit easier. The screwdriver can then be taken out, the gear can be lifted up slightly, and the bolt can be put in its place. This is another bolt that has an important torque setting. With the timing chain gear back in, the tensioner goes in next. With that bolted down, the temporary locking screw can be removed. This releases the tensioner and retensions the cam chain. The little adjuster screw goes in. Finally, the cover can be put on and tightened up. Before I put the cams and the followers and everything back in, I just want to show you how the Honda Vtec system works. So we've got the camshaft here, this is the intake cam, and the little followers here. So normally, when the engine's running, it's using these 2 outer cams here, and they act onto the 2 outer followers. And then this little middle bit here just sort of sits there. When the Vtec system's engaged, there's a little pin that shoots across in here, and under the hydraulic pressure from the Vtec solenoid, it joins these 3 together. And then the system's using this central cam. So the central cam is pushing on this central follower, which is then connected to the 2 outer ones, which then push down on the valves through these bits here. Now the central cam, you can see, is a lot bigger and has got more duration. So what that means is it opens the valve further and it holds it open for longer. And what that does is on the intake side, it lets more fuel and air in, and on the exhaust side, it lets more exhaust gases out. So at higher revs, you're making more power. When the VTec system's not engaged, the central followers sit on these little sprung pads, and that just stops them bouncing around, making a racket and getting damaged inside the engine. Here comes the camshaft holder lowers and all the rocker arms. Again, these are all doweled on so that they're accurately positioned. The two stainless steel tubes are just there to hold all the rocker arms out of the way while I position the camshaft holders. They just take a little bit of light coaxing to make sure that they're fully sat down. Then it's just a case of checking all the rockers are in the correct position. The camshafts have picked up a little bit of corrosion from the water that's got mixed with the oil after the cylinder head gasket's gone, so they just get a light polish over with some really fine Scotch-Brite to take that away. I just put a little bit of engine oil in all of the cam journals, just to make sure that there's a little bit of lubrication in there for when the engine does restart. Exhaust cam first, nice and gently. The journals are very soft compared to the cams and very easy to damage. Then the intake. They won't go all the way in, because some of the cams are actually pushing down on the valves in this position. In the previous video, we saw these timing marks on the gear that line up with the top of the timing case, and these marks on the camshaft pulleys that line up with each other. By checking these again now, that tells me that I've got the engine timed correctly. Another coat of oil before the top caps go on. Just like with the cylinder head bolts, the torque value and tightening sequence of the camshaft holder bolts is very important. You can see here that I've got the workshop manual for the engine open on an old laptop. It might seem like a bit of a luxury, but having a computer that doesn't matter if it gets a bit oily and dirty in the workshop is super useful. With the camshafts locked down, the next thing to do is set the valve clearances. The valve clearance is just a small gap between the end of the rocker arm and the top of the valve stem. Its main job is to allow for thermal expansion in the valve stems as the engine gets hotter. If there was no room for the valve stems to expand into, as the engine increases in temperature, the valves would be held open when you want them to be shut. You typically find that the valve clearance is slightly higher on the exhaust side, and this is because that side of the engine gets hotter. Setting the clearances is relatively straightforward. You just test it with a feeler gauge, and then loosen the locking nut, adjust the screw until you've got a nice drag on the right size feeler gauge, and then tighten the locking nut back up again. That's the internal work done. Let's get the rocker cover back on and keep the dirt out. There's a little rubber seal inside these holes that goes down around the spark plug tubes. I've just got my finger in there to just kind of shifty it out of the way so it doesn't get damaged. Spark plugs next. Now, I will do a compression test before I restart the engine, but I like to fully rebuild it first. That seems like a bit anal, but it's a cheap insurance policy against having accidentally left something inside the engine. I think it's better safe than sorry, and it only takes 2 minutes to get the plugs out again. A little bit of coil pack spaghetti next. The S2000 engine uses a system called Coil on plug. This means that each individual spark plug has its own individual coil. Now this typically gives you a stronger spark, which is required for higher compression engines. This is the V-tec solenoid that we were talking about earlier, or as I prefer to call it, the fun switch. No, you numpty, it goes up the other way. That's better. Because of the angle of the cylinder head and the proximity to the chassis rails, fitting the exhaust manifold on this is actually quite fiddly. Let's get all of that contaminated engine oil out, shall we? Yummy. I have the oil filter on a remote adapter because there isn't enough room for it on the side of the block because it would interfere with the steering column. Once everything's back together, my plan is to flush the system through with some cheap oil, run it for about 5 minutes, and then I can switch it out for the good stuff. Oil cooler as well. While investigating the overheating problem of the engine, I actually discovered that the oil temperature is far too low, so it's being overcooled. So I'm having a little rejig of the oil system while I rejig the cooling system. I'd like to get rid of these braided hoses as well. They just seem to cause nothing but problems. The radiator support brackets just pop riveted on, so that's easy enough to remove. And out comes the radiator. The plan is to relocate the radiator to the front of the car and convert it from a vertical flow to a cross flow. This should significantly improve the system's efficiency. To do this, I'm going to have to move the inlet from here to somewhere around here and relocate the radiator cap to somewhere over here. But I think we'll save that for the next video.